This class is known as the history of anthropological thought. The premise of the class was we were going to read this new book with these new editors, and they were going to tell us cool new things. And that we were going to have, as the book describes, anthropological theory for the 21st century. We're seem to be well into by now. And as you think about your final project, it's based on whether or not there is an anthropological theory for the 21st century that makes any sense. Because I'm beginning to wonder if anything that came out in, say, the 21st century is any better than the stuff that came out for the last century. Maybe we just needed an anthropology for the 20th century, and that was good enough. Maybe we can't do the 21st century, or maybe we just need to go back. My bigger question is, does our new articles, as we read along, does it actually significantly add or change anything? Or does it just introduce new equations and words that are harder and harder to understand? And if you stare at them long enough, they make less and less sense. So I'm probably going to say some mean things now about our last authors that we read in the last section, section 9. For example, Donna Haraway on feminism, perspective, and all those things. Did this get you anywhere different than what the 1970s feminists would have done? You're shaking your head no. I'm having trouble thinking that it's a huge advance on what was already being said about situated knowledge. I think that maybe, again, I'm being mean here. I also found that Delmos Jones, as I described, like he was talking about decolonization and things that we should be clear to everyone back in 1995, which was 30 years ago, almost. And still to this day, we talk about decolonization as it's the next best thing that we haven't done yet. And he's already moved on and passed away, sadly. But the thing is where did that go? Again, in the last class or 2 classes ago, and I may be being mean, but I did wonder to the extent that whether teaching to transgress and the ideas that were presented there as more politically engaged were really that different than what Ruth Benedict had pointed out before. Now, to the credit of Davis here, who was our author, she does cite these earlier people, such as Hurston, as inspiration. So it's not that she's saying that she's something new, but again, I wonder to the extent this is new or different than what we've had before. Oh yes, our revisiting of anthropologies of the South in this anthropology in Southern Africa section. But again, I wondered here about whether this idea of citizen anthropology was really that different from what the earlier people were doing, say Franz Boas or even Lewis Henry Morgan, who were studying with fellow citizens, admittedly indigenous Americans, but what was the difference of that? And then finally, and again, I don't want to be mean to people who are still alive and might come after me, but I wonder to the extent, does Perley's piece improve on what Beatrice Medicine had already said about Native American anthropology? Ironic, so he's speaking to anthropologists, but why couldn't he just say something that we can understand? I don't know. Yeah, anyway, I don't want to be mean here, but I do wonder sometimes, and that's setting the stage for our next section, section 10, which is called On Theorizing Globalization. No, this was the graphic they wanted me to show you. That was from their slides. Again, we have this image of globalization that is like this new and different thing. So in their On Theorizing Globalization, in their initial introduction to this, they tell us that socioeconomic, the editors of this tell us, the socioeconomic interconnectedness and exchange are enduring features of humankind. So hopefully, yes, we know that from all of our other studies in anthropology, that people are always interconnected and exchanging with each other. But the idea of globalization is that in the last 2 decades of the 20th century, we have a new rapid global spread of capitalist modes of production. So the idea here is that with the fall of communism, basically around 1989 or 1990, the dissolution of the Soviet Socialist republics, the reunification of Germany from East and West into one Germany again, and then the change in Chinese production so that it's basically exporting and selling things to all the world, that this results in a radical extension of capitalism. And the idea, as they say, is that there is deterritorialization. People are unmoored from their territories, they migrate, and there's new global configurations of power, so that for anthropology, it required rethinking often taken for granted conceptions of space, place, culture, and inequality. So that's what this section is supposed to be about. And it's a pretty common idea in anthropology. In fact, it was so common that in the olden days, in old textbooks, the globalization chapter always used to be the last chapter because it was like, okay, we're going to tell you about today's world. It's globalization. Now, that's what our editors say. I put in this red line here to say, this is what I'm going to say, drawing on other people, which is, I don't always know exactly what is truly new or larger than in the last century, say the 19th century. And that is to say, in terms of the percentage of people who migrated or immigrated in that century, it's unclear to me that it is actually larger than in the last 20 or 30 years. If you look at, for example, I've showed you in some ways, everybody gets excited about migration and the border in the United States right now. But we are not at the same percentage of foreign born as we were back in 1910 or 1920. That's still the high point of foreign born people in the United States. So it's sometimes unclear whether there's anything that new about what people celebrate as globalization. I also, you notice that this section is not at the very end of the textbook, as it used to be in the olden days, 20 years ago. That's because in some ways there's been a lot of backlash against the idea of deterritorialization and against this idea of flexible citizenship, you might say. And what we see instead is what our 2024 election and 2020 election and 2016 election seem to be about is what kind of nationalism, what kind of place is the United States and other countries going to be? And there have been many elections which have brought people to power, which insist that Italians shouldn't be welcoming to people from other places, for example, in Italy and other countries, not just in the United States. There's been a pretty huge backlash against this idea of globalization and migration. So that is my setting up of this, and I'll talk about the ethno-nationalism and those ideas when we get to the Iowa Ong piece. But we start back with an article by Arjun Appadurai called Theory in Anthropology, Center and Periphery. And this is our oldest article. It comes to us from 1986. And I actually want to situate that article back in some stuff that we already talked about. That this is toward the ends of around the 80s and then the early 90s. And we talked about anthropology and the savage slot and Abu Lugode's Writing Against Culture, which both appeared in this book titled Recapturing Anthropology. And I claim that this was a anthropology 3.0 movement, and that Trujillo was writing about how anthropology would be able to attack the savage slot itself, this idea that people were locked into this. And Appadurai's work at the time was something that both Abu Lughod and Trujillo were reading and drawing upon. And so the idea that certain people got slotted into ways of thinking about them, which stuck, was something that Appadurai had talked about and talks about in this article as a gatekeeping concept. So the idea is that when you go or study a certain people get basically locked into ideas about them. The reason he calls it gatekeeping concepts is we assume that culture is out there in this place, right? We assume people are out there and that we have to get there to find them. So we journey out there when we find them. And what he says is that for anthropologists and historians, where you go is going to heavily influence what you study. And so because you have to read what's already been written, or you have to talk to people who have already studied there. And so what he's arguing here is that certain regions, certain areas get basically locked into these ideas, and that some of them are interesting, but some of them are simply what he calls anthropological fashion. So it just happens to be that the first anthropologist who went to, I don't know, let's say Egypt, got really interested in kinship. And so then that place becomes the place where you go to study that. His best example, and maybe we do this here, is from South Asia or from India. Anybody ever take the Anthropology of South Asia course here? Yeah. So if you take, or you told your mom, I'm taking the Anthropology of South Asia, what do you think you're going to have to study? What do you have to read about inevitably if you're in that class? Yeah, the caste system. That's what everybody thinks, right? It has to be. I don't know. Did you do that? It's not that it's not existent, but it's like you have to read about it. And if you were an anthropologist, that would be what you would be studying, caste and the hierarchical caste system, right? And so he says that there's different ways this works. On page 269, hierarchy in India, honor and shame in the circum-Mediterranean, filial piety in China. So if you're going to study China, you have to talk about kinship and filial piety, are all examples of what one might call gatekeeping concepts. So things that you basically have to study. And he says that the consequences of this, the study of other issues in the place in question is retarded. Now, by that, he means slowed down so that you don't study it, but it's an interesting way to put it. And the overall nature of the anthropological interpretation of the particular society runs the risk of serious distortion. So because, in fact, everybody who went to X place, or whenever you go to this place, you're expected to study or to comment on this subject, it ends up being potentially distortive. As I said, I don't know if you can, it's impossible, in fact, to avoid, but you could try to perhaps argue against it. So he says that India remains a stellar example of the anthropological black hole, where a variety of ideas, findings, and possibilities vanish from the metropolitan gaze. And by metropolitan, he means that's where he comes back to the idea of center and periphery. There's a certain production of anthropological theory or ideas about other places. The gaze comes from this central area out onto the people. Now, you might be wondering what the heck this article is doing in a section on globalization, which I wondered myself here, because for me, it fits back better in the idea of slots and gatekeepers. I would have put it back there. Maybe it's because Appadurai gets known for like being the ethnoscape guy. And so it's somewhat ironic that his idea of ethnoscapes, this I just got from the web, of these scapes, becomes a gatekeeping concept for if you're going to study globalization. Everybody would be like, well, have you read Appadurai and the ethnoscapes and the technoscapes and the finance scapes and media scapes and ideal escapes? Actually, only ethnoscape stuck. It's the only one I can remember from this. So he becomes, in some ways, a gatekeeper concept or a gatekeeping guy for people who study globalization. And if you trust different accounts, he himself becomes an academic gatekeeper and keeps people from studying certain issues or even being hired in certain places. The second article, Akil Gupta and James Ferguson. I could just note the year on this, moving up a little bit, 1992, a mere 30 years ago. Beyond culture. I actually think this article is unnecessarily hard in the sense that if they just said what they meant, maybe if they gave you some pictures, it would help. They're talking about the way that the world is divided up into maps. We imagine the world as that people come in these countries and that each country corresponds to a territory that is often a different color on a map and has these borders, and all the people in that country are called a certain thing. So there's this country called Nigeria, and all the people in it are Nigerians and have the same culture, and they might be blue because that's the color it is on the map, as opposed to the people in, say, Ethiopia, who are all Ethiopians. It might be kind. And so we have these maps in our head in which countries are exhibited as these solid colors. And on the one hand, this is good to have a map of the countries of Africa because it gets us away from that other terrible thing that people think that Africans are just all the same, and you just lump the whole continent together and you say, I want to study Africa, which is pretty hard to do because here we have all these differences. So they're arguing against that idea, but they're also arguing against this anthropological idea sometimes that in some ways, anthropologists just made these places smaller. So again, this is sometimes a good thing because what we're saying is Nigeria is itself diverse and has these different groups in it, like the Tiv or the Igbo or the Hausa. And it's good for people to recognize that a country is not just made up of only people that Nigeria is itself diverse. But on the other hand, it simply takes this concept of a block of people of a certain color or map and territorializes them so that they become this block of people. Now, at the end, you had to read this book. They give us Marjorie Shostak's Nisa, The Life and Words of a Woman. This was a big book in anthropology. Even I heard of this book. And, they say that this is a celebrated book because it's the story of a woman from her individual perspective, but they compare it to a book that I'd never heard of, because what a yucky title. Edwin Wilson's book called Land Filled with Flies, A Political Economy of the Kalahari. And what they say Wilson does is show us how actually these so-called Bushmen are part of a wider network of people, and that they aren't this primordial group, but they really come about from what they call the retribalization of the colonial period. And it's not that the people didn't exist there, it's that they were then locked into this slot of being this tribe of people who were supposed to be hunting and gathering out there. And if you were not hunting and gathering, then you became something else. You became a cattle herder. Whereas really before colonialism, there was a mix of both cattle herding and hunting and gathering, and people were moving around. So they make several important points based on this, all on page 273. Their idea is that spaces have always been hierarchically interconnected. So before colonialism, and that we had this interconnection of spaces, and that instead of assuming the autonomy of the primeval community, be it the Bushmen or the Tiv or the Hausa or whatever, we need to examine how it was formed as a community out of the interconnected space that always already existed. And then finally, the irony of these times, however, is that as actual places and localities become ever more blurred and indeterminate, ideas of culturally and ethnically distinct places become perhaps even more salient. So what they are saying is that although people have always been moving around and are always interconnected, we're more and more thinking of them as locked into this ethnically distinct place of culture. Now, let's think about this for a second. Have we read anything in this class that talked about how people are always interconnected and always migrating and always moving around? And maybe this even happened before colonialism. Talking about the Silk Road. Yeah. What's strange to me about this is we already looked at this. We already saw this back in Eric Wolf's book in 1982. Now, maybe in a different part of this article or chapter, Gupta and Ferguson do cite Eric Wolf and talk about him, but it's strange to me that Wolf is categorized as the person who does history, and that these people are categorized as the people who do globalization. And so to me, as I was saying before, it is unclear that Gupta and Ferguson and some of the things in this article do much more than provide new buzzwords or new fancy vocabulary for what had already been described in different ways that people were not isolated. I said all this before, or Wolf said this. Now, speaking of buzzwords, so her central point, mutations in citizenship, right, is we have this citizenship bundle. Oh, that's an easy word. A bundle. This is on page 278. We used to think of different dimensions of citizenship, rights, entitlements, estate, territoriality, etc., as more or less tied together. So basically the idea was that in the old days, we thought of rights, a territory, a state, it all came together. But in these days, it's disarticulated. I think I meant to say page 278. My middle-aged sight is lacking here. So that this bundle is now being put into different places. Now, she's drawing upon, and her own work, flexible citizenship. Yeah, she's talking about these highly skilled migrants, sometimes expatriates who are getting the benefits of citizenship, maybe traveling to Asia. Maneuvers of mobile subjects who respond fluidly and opportunistically to dynamic borderless market conditions. So I don't know, people who go to different countries and they're enjoying the benefits of citizenship because they're profiting from that. And she says then global markets induce such activities so that, quote, flexibility, migration, and relocations, instead of being coerced or resisted, have become practices to strive for rather than stability, end quote. So she's quoting somebody here who says that instead of being forced to migrate and trying to resist, people are striving for these conditions. They want to be in them. Now, this is a big claim to make, right? You're saying, hey, instead of having forced migrations, now people are striving for that rather than stability. And she's quoting somebody. So you want to know who she's quoting in this article? It turns out she was quoting herself. And I know sometimes you do have to draw upon your own work, but my feeling is that if you're going to make a claim like this, I'd like to know if somebody else makes that claim. I'd like to hear somebody say this. There's a lot of claims here, but there are a few examples. There are a lot of words. The other thing that worries me about Aiwa Ong's work, or the title of this book, like if you just pick this book up, if you just happen to come across it, I'm not saying that you would read it. It's a very famous book. I don't see people outside of anthropology really drawing upon this book that much, in part because, as this article, it's so dense that nobody really understands what it is. But if you just gave this to somebody and said, here, I have a present for you, what might they think about what Ong was describing? How might they react? If you gave this to one of your parents or your grandparent, What might they say heading into the 2024 election? Yeah, I can see a lot of people getting pissed off. They're like, yeah, that's what I'm talking about. These people are coming here. They're trying to get all flexible on the citizenship stuff. It shouldn't be flexible. It should be what I want to do. We've got to keep these flexible people out, right? If you just looked at it and looked at the title, ironically, she's talking about the elite people who are maybe like us crossing borders and living in Asia when she talks about flexible citizenship. But like, if you just looked at it today and you were watching Fox News, you'd be like, yeah, well, oh, I knew it. They don't care about the nation state anymore. They should. And that's why I'm voting the way I'm voting for. You know what I mean? I haven't seen this done, but I can see it, somebody trying it on me. So it's not that she doesn't realize the potential of this all to go the other direction. It is by no means clear that the right to survival will everywhere be translated into citizenship. All right, let's just pause there for a second. The right to survival. Is that a basic right? Do we have the right to survival? One would think that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? One would think that there is a basic right to survival. Of all the human rights, I would say that I would agree the most with the right to survive. And what she says it's not clear that that will be translated into citizenship. That's for sure. Actually, I'm going to add in my that's for sure. Because, like, do people even have a right to survive? I don't even know if that's clear anymore. The last few years have taught me that the idea that people have a right to survive is severely under question in today's world. And it certainly doesn't mean that we're going to give anybody citizenship just because they're there. And we're not legitimizing them on the grounds of common humanity. This is depressingly being questioned every single day, I feel like, for the last, I don't know, certainly the last 6 months and maybe the last 2 years. Grounds of common humanity or relevance to labor markets. People are trying to come to this country because they want to give us food, they want to help us out, and they're very relevant to our labor markets. But does that mean we're going to help them out? No, it does not mean anything. It is by no means clear. Yes, it is by no means clear. In fact, it has become abundantly clear that there is no right to survival and there's no right to citizenship. And we're not going to legitimize anybody on the grounds of common humanity. And we really don't care where they're working or if they're working or not. We just want to get them back. So, yeah. I'm a little bit suspicious of how this work might get used. Hopefully, when was this? This was a while ago, 2006, yeah. 2006, what was going on then? You were 3. Yeah.